Chapter 4. It is not uncommon in the course of acquaintance for two persons to meet again under circumstances less formal than those which first introduced them. And it is often in such moments, when expectation is diminished and attention less guarded, that impressions are either confirmed or quietly undone. Whether this was to be the case for Miss Vesta and Mr. Gale de Carios, neither could yet have determined, though both, had they been inclined to examine their own thoughts with perfect honesty, might have admitted to some degree of anticipation not entirely accounted for by indifference. The opportunity presented itself sooner than either might have expected. Vesta, having been prevailed upon by Carlac to accompany her a short distance beyond the house, and then as quickly abandoned in favour of a more animated conversation with Mr. Ravengard, found herself at liberty to return alone. That she did so without regret must not be supposed, but neither did she hurry, for she was not of a disposition to resent happiness in others merely because it was not, at that moment, her own. She had nearly reached the outer steps when she perceived that she was not alone. It had not, in truth, been Mr. de Carios's original intention to present himself so soon again at Halcyon's residence, for though he was not insensible to the peculiar interest the household had inspired, he was not a man accustomed to acting upon inclination without sufficient justification. That such justification was, nevertheless, provided, must be attributed less to chance than to design. Minthara Benre, whose attention, once engaged, was not easily diverted, had expressed a degree of curiosity regarding the household which, though conveyed without emphasis, admitted of no misunderstanding. "They are inconsistent," she had observed. "I prefer to understand inconsistencies." Gale, who had no desire to be made the subject of similar scrutiny, had not thought it prudent to refuse her. "You wish me to call?" "I wish you to observe." "And report?" "I will determine what is worth reporting." There are, perhaps, many ways in which such a request might be declined, but Gale, who was not in the habit of declining Minthara when her interest was engaged, had instead found himself, on the following morning, approaching a house he could not, with perfect honesty, claim he would otherwise have avoided. That he arrived at a moment when the household was not fully assembled was, he told himself, a matter of convenience. That he did not immediately depart upon discovering it, so was, perhaps, less easily explained. Mr. de Carios stood at some little distance, as if undecided whether to remain or depart, and though his attention appeared directed elsewhere, it was evident, upon her approach, that he was aware of her presence. For a moment neither spoke. It was Vesta who broke the silence. "Sir." "Miss Vesta." There are forms of civility which, though perfectly correct, do little to ease an acquaintance, and this was one of them. "I trust," she said, with a composure that owed more to determination than ease, "that you find your time here agreeable." "I do," he replied. "Your household is singular." "I believe that is meant as praise." "It is meant as accuracy." "Then I shall accept it as both." Gale inclined his head, as if acknowledging a point well managed. "I had not expected," he said after a moment, "to find myself so frequently in company here." "Nor we you," she returned. "I suspected as much. And yet you persist." "I am capable," he said, "of revising my expectations." "How admirable! It is a quality not universally possessed." "I have found it necessary." "And do you find it comfortable?" "No." Vesta regarded him with a look which, though not unkind, was not without amusement. "That is at least honest." "I endeavour to be so." "I had not formed that impression." "No," he said, with a slight tightening of expression which he did not entirely succeed in concealing. "I believe you had not." There was a pause. If either had been inclined to withdraw, the opportunity was present, yet neither chose to take it. "You will forgive me," said Vesta at length, "if I do not immediately alter my opinion. First impressions, I find, are not easily dismissed." "Nor should they be," he replied. "They are often correct." "Then I am glad we are in agreement. I did not say they were always correct. Nor did I say they were always incorrect. Then we are, perhaps, less in agreement than you suppose. That would not be the first time." Gale allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, though whether at her remark or at his own restraint, it would have been difficult to say. "I fear," he said, "that I may have given you reason to think me less agreeable than I might wish to be." "You need not trouble yourself," she returned. "I do not require universal agreement in order to be content. That is fortunate. For me, certainly. And for those who disagree with you? That remains to be seen." There was, in this exchange, something of contest, though not yet of hostility, for while neither sought to yield, neither was entirely unwilling to engage. Gale drew a breath, as if upon the edge of saying more, and then, with an effort which did not escape her notice, altered his course. "You were walking this morning," he said. "I hope you found it pleasant." "I did. The grounds here are well suited to it." "They are." Another pause. If the conversation had begun with restraint, it now continued with a degree of caution which suggested that both were aware of its instability, though neither could quite determine how to improve it. At length Vesta spoke again. "You are not," she said, "as you were described to me." "No, no." "And how was I described?" She hesitated, only slightly but enough to be observed. "With admiration," she said at last, "which I find does not always correspond to my own experience." "That is not uncommon. I am glad to hear it. You prefer your own judgment." "I do. As do I." "Then we are alike in at least one respect, perhaps in more." "I should not wish to presume," she said lightly. "Nor should I," he returned. Yet there was, in his tone, something which suggested that he had already done so. There are, in conversation, certain moments at which wit ceases to clarify and begins instead to obscure. And though both Miss Vesta and Mr. Decarios were well supplied with the former, neither could claim to be much assisted by it at present. Vesta drew a breath, as if upon the edge of patience. "What," she said at last with less ornament than she had thus far employed, "are you actually doing here?" The question, though plainly put, was not without force. Gale did not answer immediately. It was not, perhaps, that he lacked a reply, but that he was, for once, unwilling to give the one most readily available. There are truths which, though simple, resist expression when they risk being misunderstood. And there are others which, though more acceptable, fail to satisfy the conscience in being spoken. "I had reason to call," he said at length. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not. And yet, it is the one you offer." "It is the one I can offer," he returned, with a steadiness that suggested both restraint and intention. Vesta regarded him with renewed scrutiny. "You are very determined," she said, "to be obscure." "I am attempting," said Gale, "to be precise. I should be obliged if you would attempt, instead, to be understood." For a moment it seemed he might. There was, in his expression, something very near to decision, something which, had it been given voice, might have altered the entire course of her opinion. But whatever he intended was not spoken, for at that instant the sound of approaching voices interrupted them. "Vesta." Carlack's voice carried with it such unrestrained pleasure that it required no further introduction. She appeared at once, Will beside her, both of them animated by a happiness so evident that it rendered all preceding tension, if not insignificant, at least momentarily displaced. "There you are," she continued, taking Vesta's hands without hesitation. "I was just saying, you must come in. You've missed everything, and it's only just begun." "I assure you," said Vesta, though not unkindly, "I have missed very little." "Then you must miss no more," Carlac replied, undeterred. "Come." There are few forces so difficult to resist as enthusiasm sincerely felt, and Vesta, though not unwilling to remain where she was, found herself nevertheless drawn away by it. "You will excuse me," she said, turning back only briefly. "Of course," said Gale. If there was more he might have said, the opportunity did not present itself again. Will, who had observed enough to understand that something of less ease than his own happiness had passed between them, lingered a moment. "My friend," he said with a smile that was both warm and knowing, "you appear to have chosen a most inconvenient place for reflection." "It would seem so." "And one," Will continued, "in which you are unlikely to improve your position by remaining." Gale allowed himself a breath that might almost have been called a concession. "You suggest retreat." "I suggest," said Will lightly, "a more favourable field. The rooms in town are not yet insupportable, and I am expected there. You may find the company less resistant." Gale glanced not down the road but in the direction Vesta had been led. "That seems improbable." "Then you will be pleasantly surprised." There are moments at which persistence ceases to be productive. And though Gale was not a man inclined to abandon a matter unfinished, he was not incapable of recognising when it would not be advanced by immediate continuation. "Very well," he said at last. Will's expression brightened. "Excellent. I shall claim the credit for your improved judgment later." "I would not advise it. I rarely take advice in matters where I am clearly correct." Gale almost smiled, and with that they turned, not towards the house but away from it, leaving behind what had not been resolved and carrying with them perhaps more of it than either intended. If Miss Vesta had been carried into the house with less intention than energy, it must be attributed to the force of Miss Carlac's spirits, which, once engaged, were not easily resisted. "You must come. Oh, you must come at once," she said, drawing her forward with such eagerness as admitted of no refusal. "I have something to tell you, and I cannot bear to wait another moment." "I begin to suspect," said Vesta, allowing herself to be led, "that I am to be made very happy whether I consent to it or not." "You will consent," Carlac replied. "You must. I am already persuaded." They had scarcely reached a quieter room before Carlac turned to her, her expression so full of feeling that even Vesta, who had seen her in many moods, paused in expectation. "He has asked me," she said. "There are declarations which, though anticipated, produce no less effect in being spoken, and this was one." "Mr. Ravengard," said Vesta, though the answer was evident. Carlac laughed a little breathlessly. "Yes, Will. Oh, I cannot grow used to calling him anything else. He has asked me, and I—" "And you have said yes," Vesta finished, her own pleasure now fully engaged. "I could not say anything else." "You could not," Vesta agreed warmly. "Nor would I have allowed it." Carlac caught her hands again. "You are not surprised?" "I am only surprised it was not done sooner." "So am I," Carlac said, with a frankness that would have alarmed a more cautious mind. "But he wished to be certain, and I think I was certain from the beginning." "That is not always a safe position," Vesta said lightly. "No," Carlac replied, her smile softening. "But it is a very happy one." "And you are happy." "I am," she said simply. There was, in her manner, nothing of triumph, nothing of display, only that steady warmth which, being genuine, requires neither concealment nor ornament. Vesta, who loved her too well to withhold any portion of her own satisfaction, embraced her with a sincerity equal to her friend's. "You deserve it," she said, "and he deserves you." I think he does, Carlack replied with a small laugh. Or at least, I hope he will. I have every confidence that he will try. That is all I ask. If Miss Vesta had entered the room in spirits less composed than those she had quitted it with, she would not, perhaps, have been immediately aware of the change. For there are disturbances which do not announce themselves at once, but instead linger quietly, revealing their presence only by degrees. That such a disturbance existed, however, did not escape Miss Carlach. She had been speaking, though of what she could not afterwards have said with precision, for her attention, though willingly given, was not entirely engaged. There was, in her manner, a pause too long between her words, a glance too frequent towards her friend, which at last resolved itself into certainty. "You are not pleased," she said. Vesta, who had been considering how best to appear otherwise, was not immediately prepared to deny it. "I am very pleased," she replied after a moment. "With you." Carlack smiled, but not entirely in agreement. "And with everything else?" "That," said Vesta, "is a more complicated question." "I thought it might be." Vesta turned slightly away as if to avoid the necessity of explanation, but Carlach, whose affection was as steady as it was open, was not inclined to let the matter rest there. "It is him," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Vesta gave a small, incredulous laugh. "You are very quick." "I do not think I am wrong." "You are not," Vesta admitted, "though I cannot imagine how it can be so evident." "It is not evident to everyone," Carlack said gently, "only to those who know you. That is a comfort. It is meant to be." There was a pause. "I do not understand him," Vesta said at last. "No," Carlack replied, "I do not suppose you do." "And he does nothing," Vesta continued, with more animation, "to make himself understood. He speaks, and yet says nothing. He explains, and yet clarifies nothing. I cannot determine whether he is proud or merely—" She stopped. "Merely what?" Carlack prompted. "Merely determined not to be known." Carlack considered this. "I do not think," she said slowly, "that he is determined not to be known." "No?" "I think," she continued, "he is not very good at being known." Vesta glanced at her. "That is a distinction. It is an important one." "And how am I to discover which it is?" "I do not know," Carlack said honestly, "but I know this. Will speaks of him with great affection." "That is hardly decisive." "No," she agreed, "but it is something." "And what does he say?" "That he is kind," Carlack said, "though not always easy. That he is thoughtful, though not always clear. And that he would do more for a friend than he would ever say aloud." Vesta was silent. "I do not ask you," Carlack went on, "to like him." "I do not," Vesta said quickly. "I only—" She hesitated. "You only what?" "I only wish," she said with some frustration, "that he would either confirm my opinion or correct it. I find it very inconvenient that he does neither." Carlack smiled softly. "Not everything is decided so quickly." "It might be if people would speak plainly." "Not everyone can." "Then they must learn." "Or we must learn to understand them." Vesta gave a small shake of her head. "You are very patient." "I am very happy," Carlack replied. "It makes patience easier." There was something in this which Vesta could not immediately answer, for while she could not dispute it, she was not, at present, inclined to imitate it. "And you believe," she said at last, "that I am mistaken." "I believe," said Carlack with the utmost gentleness, "that you may not yet have all the information. That is a polite way of saying I am wrong. It is a hopeful way of saying you may not always be." Vesta laughed, though not entirely at ease. "You are very determined to defend him." "I am very determined to be fair." "And you think I am not?" I think, Carlack said carefully, that you have decided. And you have not? I have decided that Will is happy, she said, and that makes me inclined to trust what he trusts. Vesta did not immediately reply. There are few arguments so difficult to answer as those which are both reasonable and kindly meant, and though she was not persuaded, she was not untouched. I do not dislike him, she said at last. I did not think you did. I only... Yes? I find him provoking. Carlack laughed. That is something. It is not, I assure you, a recommendation. No, she said, but it is not indifference either. Vesta turned away slightly, as if unwilling to pursue the thought further. I should prefer indifference. I do not think you would, Carlack replied, and though Vesta did not agree, she did not, this time, attempt to contradict her. If Miss Carlack's happiness had been freely expressed, Mr. Ravengard's was no less so, though tempered by that consideration which leads a man, even in the height of his own satisfaction, to remember the feelings of his friends. Gale had not, upon their arrival at the rooms in town, appeared disposed for much society, but Will, who was not inclined to leave him to reflection when better occupation might be found, had drawn him aside with an air of determined cheerfulness. You must wish me joy, he said. I do, Gale replied at once, with all sincerity. Then you must do so again, for I have need of hearing it more than once. Gale allowed himself the faintest smile. I am very glad for you. And I, said Will, am very fortunate. That you are. There was no hesitation in this, for if Gale felt any complexity in his own situation, it did not extend to his estimation of Will's. You have secured, he continued, a happiness which I do not think will prove uncertain. I hope not, said Will, though I begin to suspect that certainty is less a matter of circumstance than of courage. Then you are well supplied. I endeavour to be. And Miss Carlack is everything I might have wished, and more besides. Gale inclined his head. I do not doubt it. There was a pause in which Will regarded him with a look of friendly scrutiny. And you, he said at length. I, Gale repeated. You appear, Will continued with a gentleness that did him credit, less at ease than I should like. I am very well. You are not. Gale drew a breath, as if upon the edge of explanation, and then, with visible reluctance, allowed himself to attempt it. I find, he said, that I have formed an opinion which I cannot easily dismiss, yet I have been given no reason to suppose it is welcome. That is often the case. And I am not, Gale continued more carefully, accustomed to pursuing what is, so clearly, disapproved. Will's expression softened. You are certain it is disapproved? I am certain, Gale said with a degree of dryness, not entirely without self-awareness, that I have not recommended myself. That may be remedied. I am not convinced that it may. You have not perhaps attempted it properly. Gale hesitated. I have attempted, he said, to be understood. And I find that I am not. Will smiled slightly. That is not always the fault of the listener. Nor always of the speaker. True, but you are not a man who is often misunderstood. No, Gale said, which makes it inconvenient. Inconvenient, Will repeated. I find myself, Gale said with an effort that betrayed more than he intended, in a position for which I have no established method. That, said Will, is precisely how one recognises it matters. Before Gale could reply, another voice intervened. This is inefficient. Lae'zel stood near them, her expression as unyielding as her tone. You expend considerable effort, she continued, for no defined outcome. Will turned, undisturbed. Lady Lae'zel, you hesitate, she said to Gale as if he had not been engaged in conversation at all. You calculate, and then you delay. This produces nothing. I was not aware, said Gale with restraint, that I was subject to your assessment. All things are subject to it. And your conclusion? That you proceed without structure. I proceed with caution. You proceed without clarity. Will, with admirable diplomacy, attempted to intervene. I believe my friend was merely... He was failing, Lae'zel said. Gale met her gaze. You are very certain. Yes. And you believe the matter so simple? It is simple, she replied. You desire something. You determine whether it is worthy. If it is, you act. If it is not, you discard it. And you believe this situation admits of such clarity? It does. Gale was silent. Lae'zel regarded him a moment longer. This, she said, is not how such alignments are formed. There is no strength in uncertainty. And yet, said Gale quietly, there may be error in certainty. Only for those who are wrong. Will, who had thus far maintained his composure, allowed himself a small laugh. I suspect, my dear Lae'zel, that we shall not resolve this by argument. There is nothing to resolve, she said. There is only action, or its absence. Gale did not answer. But if he had, in that moment, been required to choose between the two, it is doubtful that he would have found the decision as simple as she supposed.